And in that moment, I realized I was thinking to myself, how the heck am I going to get through this? Because every single trauma or adversity or any type of challenge or change that come my way, I'd always applied my grit mentality, right? In other words, I'd always said, you can't change it. You got to move on. You got to pick yourself back up because that's not serving you. The reason I struggled so much, and I did for a few months afterwards, in full disclosure, it took me 4 months to kind of get out of this black hole. And I remember waking up in my son's bedroom, my son that passed, and I walked into the bathroom, and I remember this window being behind me and a mirror in front, and the sunlight was just shining through this window, and it bounced off the mirror and onto my face. And it was like a light bulb just going off. And I suddenly looked at myself in the mirror and I just said, Lara, you got to wake up today. Your son did not. You get to feel the sun on your skin today. Your son does not. What are you going to do to help other people get through something, like this type of adversity? Stop making it about you. And that's when I realized, if I could understand how I have grit through the past few months from this tragedy, how I got through all my prior traumas, how was I going to utilize this pain, this grief, this trauma, and help empower other people to get through challenges in their life?
We talk a lot about resilience, grit, high performance, hustle culture, getting it done. But I feel that many or very few people have built a repeatable system around it. LJ has. She's the creator of Global Grit System and the Close System, which are frameworks designed to build discipline, execution in leadership and in sales. I've been watching everything she does, and I'm fascinated to have you here. LJ, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and sharing your wonderful audience with me today. Yes, I absolutely live and breathe grit on a daily basis. So I think at this point, it's very much ingrained in my DNA.
Let's go with the elephant in the room. Everyone talks about resilience. Everybody thinks that they are resilient. What do most people misunderstand about grit?
That's a great question, and I absolutely love that. So a lot of people will say to me, well, grit sounds like it could be a grind, right? And it's going to lead to burnout because they have this notion in their minds that grit is all about like this macho, just got to push through no matter what. And even though there is a huge element to that, right? There's actually different layers of grit. There's different levels of grit. And I discovered that I've had grit in my life, since a very, very young age. And, I can tell the listeners a little bit about that in a moment. But I will tell you that the biggest misconception is that people think that grit is just grinding. It sounds tiring. It's going to lead to burnout, and burnout is going to lead to poor performance and so forth. But I will tell you that grit unchecked leads to burnout. So as long as we check our grit and we understand which level of grit we have, because every single person that you meet, everyone, whether it's family, friends, at the workplace, no matter what, every single person you meet actually does have grit. They just have different levels of it. And the more that we understand that, the more we are able to pull from different strengths of grit from different people in different situations. So not every scenario, not every challenge or adversity or change that comes your way is going to be the same. So you have to understand, and half the people you deal with are going to be logical, the other half are emotional, right? Which means that we either think with our gut, we make decisions based on our gut. The logical are going to think with their brains, and we make decisions based on facts and data. And so therefore you have to understand how to tap into both. And the Global Grit System aligns both. It helps you understand which level of grit you actually are, which is your more dominant strength, which one you're going to fall back on in times of challenges. Because I don't really care what people's personalities are, because as far as I'm concerned, personalities can be faked. Look at job interviews, right? How many times have people hired people based on a job interview and then their performance isn't what matched the interview? Well, that's because a lot of people can put on a facade when it comes to personality, but when it comes to grit levels, you cannot. It's just something that's inbuilt in us from 10,000 years ago. And I will tell you that I am more interested in what someone's grit level is and what's their dominant grit type. So what are they going to fall back on in times of stress and adversity, and how do we counteract that? And how do we recognize the other areas of grit to pull from in those moments?
I'm reminded of when you just said everybody has grit, of like martial arts. Everybody knows how to punch. Instinctively, we know how to defend ourselves. But when you have a framework and this is how you close your hand and this is how you punch and then this is how you block, and it's really learning the craft to become lethal.
Yes.
What point of your life did you think, I need a system for this? Because if everybody has it, and I think this is when your problem becomes very personal. You're
Mhm.
like, if everybody has grit and I need grit, but I need a framework. I need to think about this. What was that moment?
It was a very prominent moment in my life, and it happened actually about 4.5 years ago. So I'll just give a little bit of a background to the audience that from a young age, I've actually faced a lot of different traumas in my life, right? I actually talk about it in my book, Hunt or Be Hunted, and I won't go into all of that today. But the point being is, from all of those traumas I went through from a young age up until, the age I am today, every single one of those traumas shaped me in some way, right? But I approached it all in the same way. In other words, I had this get it done approach, right? Somebody that just gets back up, brushes things off, moves on, looks at the solution, not the problem. And that's how I've always led my life. Well, and I thought that was the best way to attend to any type of challenge that I was faced with. Well, I moved over to this country about 10 years ago, built a business, from scratch. I was actually had a very successful career over in the UK. I was a very successful sales director and I had a fantastic business career, but my personal life, just didn't match that, and I just kept having all these
Mhm.
issues in it. And when I moved over to the US, I built a business, and I met my ex-husband and ended up having three beautiful boys, right? um, and I thought to myself in that moment, like many, right, we can become complacent. I took my foot off the gas and thought, well, I've kind of, made it. I had a beautiful home, I had the car, I had the American dream, I had the kids, I had the husband at the time, I had everything that I had dreamed of having. And I made a mistake where, like I said, I took my foot off the gas and I became complacent. And it's very easy to do, when you get into that kind of mode in life and you kind of think, well, maybe I deserve to take a little bit of a break. Maybe I don't need to worry about any grit coming my way anymore because I've faced it all. That's a big mistake, because if you're not on alert for anything that could happen, right? In other words, and I'm not saying you have to remain in this fight or flight mode, but you do need to have great awareness and prepare for things that could come your way. Or in other words, train yourself in the moments where nothing is going wrong. So when grit does face you, you are better prepared to face it. And 4.5 years ago was my pivotal moment and changed everything in my life. It completely changed the trajectory of not just my business life, but also my personal life. And unfortunately, 4.5 years ago, my youngest son, Jack, who was just a baby at the time, he passed away. And I nearly lost my life the very same night. And I remember it vividly as though it was yesterday. And everything happened so fast. But I was rushed to hospital. My son had already passed. There was nothing they could do for him. They couldn't bring him back. And there I was in the hospital being hooked up to all these machines. They took my son away from me because, he'd already passed and they were trying to save my life. And about 3 hours into me being actually laying in that hospital bed, I suddenly sat bolt upright. And I remember just screaming, saying, "Get me water, I'm going to die." And they said, "You can't have water. You're going to have surgery." And I said, "Get me water. I'm going to die." And I just felt like everything was draining from me. Like I'd never felt that in my life. I just knew that this was it. Well, all of a sudden, in that moment, I collapsed back on the bed. My pupils stopped responding. My eyesight started tunneling. My hearing started to go muffled. My coordination went. My speech slurred. And my blood pressure just plummeted. It plummeted down to 53/37. And I remember looking at the monitor, and that's how my grandmother passed away. So I knew that the next beep and flash, I wouldn't know about it because I'd be dead. And so I knew I roughly had probably about 8 seconds, 8, 10 seconds maximum at this point. And suddenly, I hear nurses and doctors panicking. They're screaming for an emergency blood transfusion. I was losing so much blood internally, and I don't think they'd actually picked up on that until that moment. Suddenly, there was a crash cart that came pulling into the room, and I just remember everything just being it was so chaotic. It was such chaos. Now, my background is also in psychology, right? So I have, I'm educated in psychology and counseling, mental health counseling, and neuroscience. So I knew that if I panicked, right, along with everybody else, I was just going to die quicker. because what was going on is my heart didn't have enough blood in its body to pump around. So my organs were shutting down one by one. So I knew I had to slow my heart rate down. Now, for those that may have read the book or, want to read the book, I do talk about this at some point where, look, if you, and this is important for me to continue telling the story, but if you want to have motivation to act on something, right, we have to have belief. And in order to create the belief that we can do something, you have to change your environment. So that's one of the reasons why 10 years ago I moved from the UK to the US, because I changed my environment. Because I always said, if you want to be aligned, train with them. Well, in this moment when I was in the hospital bed and I was dying and everything was going on around me, I realized that the only way I could take control of the situation to help myself with slowing my heart rate down was I had to change my environment. But I couldn't do that physically, right? Impossible. But mentally, right up here, I still had my brain. And I said, okay, I can change my environment. And I'm going to use a technique that I've taught a lot of other people called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 approach. So I started saying to myself, what's the last thing you want to see before you die? And I also said to myself, you've got 2 options. Number 1, you accept it and you're going to die. Number 2, you accept it, you're probably going to die, but you have to have the belief that they're going to bring you back. And that's the one I chose, right? And that's when I realized, well, I've got to change the environment. So I started picturing myself back at home with my living kids, who were only 2.5 and 1 at the time. And I said, okay, what's the 5 things you can see? What's the 4 things you can hear? 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And I still remember that as though that was a vivid memory. And now I actually created that memory, right? It wasn't real, but I created that memory, almost like a movie that you start to play in your mind. And anybody can do this, right? You can picture a horrible scene and then picture a happy place and start focusing on the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and start attaching that to your memory versus the trauma, right? So anyway, I was picturing this with my children, and it actually helped calm my heart rate because my anxiety started to lower, because I felt happy, right, in that moment when I was with my children, even though it wasn't a real memory, I was creating it as though it were. And you can do that through your senses. And as a result of my lowering my heart rate, the doctors and nurses had more time to figure out how to get the 16 gauge needle into my collapsed veins with the blood that saved my life. And so I was whisked off into surgery and my life was saved. And so I'm here to tell the story. And I'll just add to that, if I may, that when I woke up from that ordeal, I will never forget how the doctors reacted. Now, again, remember what I said earlier, half the people that you deal with are emotional, half the people are logical. Doctors are very logical. And I'm not saying all are, but most are. And the way they reacted to this is not the way that I expected them to react. And now I'm a very logical person, right? But this was a very emotional event. And, they do see death very often. I was in the ER at that point. So therefore, how they treat it is going to be very different maybe to if I was in the maternity ward. Because how this all transpired is I went into early labor and I actually had to deliver my son myself at home, which is why there was so much confusion between, what had actually gone on and what had happened. And they didn't realize that I had what's called a retained placenta, and that's what nearly killed me. So anyway, moving forward, when I woke up from the surgery, the first thing that they asked me is, do you want to have your son buried or cremated? Which funeral directors do you want to use? We have to transport his body. It was horrific. It was horrendous. And they said, here's a death certificate you have to fill in. And my mind is just exploding at this point because I'm trying to process what just happened literally 12 hours earlier. And all of a sudden, I don't have my son anymore. And now I nearly didn't even make it back to see my living kids, who had no idea what was going on, by the way, because they were sleeping. It was at nighttime this all happened. And they were fast asleep. I actually had a neighbor that stayed with them that night. They had no idea. They just saw me come back in the morning, and they asked about the baby because I still had, a belly, as if I were pregnant still with him, because it all happened when I was in my second trimester. And that was devastating. I had to tell them that they wouldn't ever get to meet their brother, that their brother didn't come home with me. And, I didn't obviously tell them that I didn't nearly come home. One day they'll know of that story, but they're just too little as of right now. But that was a huge pivotal moment in my life. And bearing in mind I was actually running a business because when I first came to the country, I couldn't work for anyone because I didn't have a social, right? Obviously, years go by, I got married, I had a social, etc., but I'd already built a business. So, and my ex-husband didn't work. So I was the only person bringing in money into the household. So I had to support him, myself, my kids, the team that I'd built up, to make sure I could pay them so they could feed their families. And it was just absolutely horrific because I was faced with this double trauma and this grief, yet I was a leader. And in that moment, I realized I was thinking to myself, how the heck am I going to get through this? Because every single trauma or adversity or any type of challenge or change that come my way, I'd always applied my grit mentality, right? In other words, I'd always said, you can't change it. You got to move on. You got to pick yourself back up because that's not serving you. That thought process. You just got to get on with it. Now, the reason I struggled so much, and I did for a few months afterwards, in full disclosure, it took me 4 months to kind of get out of this black hole. And to be quite honest, nobody would have blamed me had I sunk deeper and deeper, right? But it took about 4 months, and I remember waking up in my son's bedroom, my son that passed, and I walked into the bathroom, and I remember this window being behind me and a mirror in front, and the sunlight was just shining through this window, and it bounced off the mirror and onto my face, and it was like a light bulb just going off. And I suddenly looked at myself in the mirror and I just said, Lara, you got to wake up today. Your son did not. You get to feel the sun on your skin today. Your son does not. What are you going to do to help other people get through something, like this type of adversity? Stop making it about you. And that's when I realized, if I could understand how I have grit through the past few months from this tragedy, how I got through all my prior traumas, how was I going to utilize this pain, this grief, this trauma, and help empower other people to get through challenges in their life, right? You don't have to have gone through something as tragic as what I've just described. It can be any type of challenge, whether it's a job loss, whether it's divorce, whether it's, you didn't get that promotion at work, whether it's a setback you've had as an entrepreneur, whatever it may be, right? There's always going to be something that comes your way that is the most traumatic thing that's happened to you in that moment, right? And I don't ever, never compare traumas with other people, because what you go through is central to you, right? And that affects you and others around you. So it's all relative, right, to each other. So anyway, in that moment, I realized I am this get it done person and a go-getter. Now, why was I struggling so much with trying to learn how I can pick myself back up from this? Well, that's when I realized I was approaching it from a logical standpoint. And what do we do as logical thinkers? We try to look for the solution. Well, the solution I wanted, I could never have, which was I wanted to bring my son back alive. Couldn't do that. So therefore, I had all this emotion attached to it, and I didn't know how to process that. And so that's when I realized I was just looking at it in the wrong way. And I was looking at this grit as this, grinding, get it done attitude, when actually I started to take a step back and I slowed my pace down with how I started to approach this. Now, I'm a very fast-paced individual. I like to get things done, but I had to slow my pace down, and that was very difficult for me. And I suddenly said to myself, Lara, if you're able to reframe how you think about the situation, so in other words, instead of saying, look what happened to me, I started saying, look what revealed me. Instead of saying, look what was taken from me, I started saying, look what was given to me. And all I did was just change one word, right, in that sentence. But just changing even just one or two words in a sentence from a negative to a positive, you end up having a physiological reaction to it. And a lot of people don't actually know this, but 80% of your thoughts are negative and 90% are repetitive. That is absolutely huge. So already, as human beings, we face a uphill struggle because we already are faced with negative thoughts on a daily basis. And a lot of people will come to me and say, well, I'm not negative. I'm a happy, positive person. I say, I'm sure you are, but you do have these thoughts. They are innate. Sometimes they come so fast, you don't even recognize it. You don't notice it. But I said, it is inbuilt in us. It's a survival instinct. It's actually a good thing that it's there, right? But it's as long as we recognize and we know how to manage it. So I started utilizing all my psychology expertise, and I said, okay, I've got to look at this from a different angle and say, is this serving me, right? This feeling that I'm sitting in right now, is it helping me in my situation? Is what I'm doing today going to help me to get to where I need to be tomorrow? And if the answer is no, then you say to yourself, okay, what I'm going to do, you sit with that feeling for a moment, which can be tough for many. You sit with that feeling for a moment and you say, okay, I'm going to put that in a box and put it on the shelf. And what you've allowed yourself to do and what you've allowed your brain to do is still process the information. Your brain now realizes it's not helpful in that moment, but it can come back to if it wants. So it hasn't gone into a panic or a fight or flight. It hasn't said, oh my gosh, like, because think about it, when you have a negative thought, what do most people do? They try to brush it off. Well, if you try to brush it off, it's like a revolving door. It'll just keep spinning and spinning, and it'll keep smacking you back in the face harder because you haven't actually acknowledged it. And that's the key, right? You don't have to accept necessarily like negative information or bad things that happen to you. You don't have to accept it, but you do have to acknowledge it. And when you acknowledge it and you say, okay, is this helping me? No. Okay, put it in a box, put it on the shelf. What have you allowed yourself to do? It's like a computer or a phone, right? You've now allowed yourself access to clear some memory, if you will, and allow your creativity to come in to help you understand, well, what are some other ways I can counteract this or help myself through this? Now, all of what I've just explained to you, I call reframing, right? It's reframing your thoughts, which actually is the R in my grit. So the G stands for get it done, the R stands for reframing. And that's when I suddenly realized if I'm able to get things done and reframe how I think, I can impact others. Because as a leader, it's not about you, right? It's about others. It doesn't matter what job you're in, what position you're in. You're a leader of someone or something, even if it's yourself, because you're leading your life. So if I'm able to get things done, reframe how I think, I'm able to impact others, which means now I have to take responsibility for every single action and inaction because it has a consequence, right? Not taking action is actually an action. In other words, you've made that decision and that choice. It has a consequence. And if you look at all the letters that the wording I just said in the beginning letters, you'll realize I just spelled grit. You got get it done for the G, reframing for the R, impact others for the I, and take responsibility for the T. And it was in that moment that I realized, wow, I just identified the 4 elements of grit, but it wasn't enough because I didn't want to just go around talking about grit because lots of people can do that. Lots of people have incredible stories where they talk about resilience and grit, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to show people that you can develop grit, which is how my system and my framework started. So I developed something called the grit type indicator, which actually shows you which grit type you are, which is your more dominant grit type. It's not personality test, it's your grit type. What do you do in times of change and challenges and adversity? Which grit type are you? How do you react in those situations? What are some behavior stresses that go on and so forth? And so from creating that indicator, it now started to create belief, right, in people that they do have grit. And from that belief, it creates the motivation to act. What happens when you're motivated to act? You're influencing how you think, right? You're influencing your cognition. When you influence your cognition, you can alter your brain processes, which is the rewiring of the brain. When you're altering your brain processes, you can now apply or adopt a growth mindset, which is what you need in order to grow, right? To continue to understand how to better yourself and so forth. Once you adopt a growth mindset, you can now apply the very thing that it is that you're trying to learn in the first place. And so the question comes back around, well, how do we create that belief? That's where you've got to change your environment because every single person learns in a different way, right? You've got to have the autonomy to learn in the way that you want to. You can't be told to learn in a certain way because some of us are visual, some of us learn through listening, and some of us are practical. And often it's the practical that gets missed. And for those of that are listening, you may have heard some of my work where I talk about going from comfort through to growth, right? How do we get from comfort and we get to that growth level? Because obviously that's, one of the reasons I'm hired. I teach a lot of that. And this is just the grit model. I haven't even got on to like the, what I call my sales execution, because I think that's a different story for another day. But on the grit side, the comfort through to the growth, I ask a lot of people, what's on the other side of comfort? And, it's fear. And then I say, well, what's on the other side of fear? And they say growth. And I say, no, there's a great big gap missing. And I like to call it the learning zone. But why is that gap missing? And it's because as a society, we have a growing need for instant gratification. We have technology at our fingertips. We have AI. We have Google. We have everything at our fingertips. And so people just are expecting things like this. The trouble with that is, as long as there's human beings around, we have a brain, right? And our brain processes at a different speed. If you are a go-getter or an innovator, right? So just to give the audience a bit of awareness with the 4 grit types, I told you the 4 elements, right? Get it done, reframe thinking, impact others, take responsibility. The 4 grit types are go-getters, reframers, innovators, and trustworthy titans. Well, innovators and go-getters have a very fast pace in the way that they process information and think. They're different in other ways. I won't get into all of that right now, but they're very fast paced. If you're a reframer or a trustworthy titan, you typically are, much slower paced, and you need to take time to process that information and dissect it in a way that makes sense to you, right? So how we learn is very, very different from each other. And every single person you come across in life is going to have a different communication style, because how I might interpret, how I process information is going to be completely different to how that person takes that information and processes it themselves. So therefore, it is critical that we understand not just our grit type, but who are we talking to, right? What grit type are they? And so the more that you learn this, the more you actually understand the framework of grit. So when you're in a situation, like when I was in my situation with my son that passed and nearly losing my life, that was a heavily emotional situation. So I had to learn how to kind of marry the logic and the emotion into one. And I had to learn how to tap into the other areas of grit. I just mentioned about I had to learn the reframing, right? I had to learn the innovation side of it, because the G came so naturally to me, but it just wasn't helpful in that situation. There's certain elements that can be helpful, but it wasn't helpful in that particular situation. And that was an extremely gritty situation. Whereas there could be other situations where the G has to take the forefront, and that's the one that you need. So when you have any challenge come your way, you just have to assess, which grit type do I need to utilize in this moment to help me move forward and move through this difficult challenge.
It's super inspirational. It's so profound. I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
I think and thank you for sharing that moment. I think that's what life is. It's my dad has a saying. He says, business problems have business solutions, but life problems need life solutions. And health is something that, we're not taught to deal with it in a way. I think that the education system fails us in a way, and it's those are everything you just mentioned. I feel that everybody should know, everybody should be aware of. It can save your life like it did to you. And I feel it's like, how do we perform under extreme situations?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the only way is you were prepared. You were a psychologist. You understood that you needed to lower your anxiety and lower your cortisol level so that you could not have 6 seconds, maybe have 2 minutes to live, and saved your life. And the doctors being maybe too close to death every day, that for them is like, do you want cremation or burial? To them is a question of admin and not necessarily of emotion.
Correct.
I'm profoundly grateful for you telling me all this, because I find that I now think of, how am I prepared for this moment?
Mm-hmm.
Am I prepared for those moments? I know that I've studied every business book, every investment book. I am preparing myself for business problems, to solve them in business solutions. But life is so much more, and so much more complex. I think maybe it gives you the perspective of when someone says, I have grit, or I have power, determination, motivation. You're like, well, have you been tested the way? And it's okay, like you said, don't compare people. But I think that we can compare ourselves. Are we, like, the question that came to my mind was like, if I had to live that moment, am I ready? Like, could I slow my heart rate at that moment?
Mm-hmm.
Could I deal with loss in 4 months and convert it into something beautiful, into teaching others, into inspiration, into gratitude?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I going to go down the route of peril and perhaps darkness?
Yep.
So I think what you've done is incredible. I'm so curious to read your book and to read more about the grid system, specifically because of that, because I think I'm everybody that's listening to this is going to be like, oh, of course I know accounting, of course I can read a spreadsheet, but can
Right.
you read these moments when you need extreme performance, and a mistake is life or death?
Yes. And it's actually understanding human behavior, right? That's a huge one because we can gain the skills that we need in, the particular vocation that we're trained to be in, right? Or that we've chosen to be in. But in, like you just said, you hit the nail on the head, in those extreme moments of how do we perform under pressure? And do we have what I call grit, which isn't just grit as everybody knows it, but the G.R.I.T, right? Do we have all four elements of grit? Do we know how to tap into those different grit types? Do we know how to communicate in those situations? Because that's going to be the difference between success and failure. 100%. You could have all the skill sets under the world, but if you don't have the grit in the way that I've just explained, it doesn't matter because you'll keep running back down to comfort and what you know, because you won't have the skill sets to get out of the fear and get into the learning zone, and then get out of the learning zone and into the growth. And all four different elements of grit and different types of grit are associated with that system. So, for example, to get out of comfort and get into fear, you do have to apply the G in grit. You have to understand how to take action. You have to understand all the different elements of that G. When you're in fear, most people will, can relate to this. You typically fall under four, one of four different types of fears, and there's loads of different fears out there, but the four major ones that I keep coming up against, with lots of people, whether it's in business or in life, it's fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of imperfection, and fear of rejection. And often we can find ourselves in one of those four, or maybe all of them, right? And there's no right or wrong. It's just that as long as you can acknowledge that and you understand that, now you can learn the skill sets to get out of that. But you're not going to learn those skill sets in your vocation. You're going to learn those skill sets from understanding the grit system. And if you have a framework that you can fall back on, it's a security, right, for people. It's a security blanket, because suddenly it's like, wow, okay, now I actually have a system I can follow. And our brains love a system. We don't thrive in chaos. And some people might say to me, well, I do thrive in chaos. That just means that you are stuck in fight or flight, right? So in other words, you are stuck in that, we have a parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic. It just means that people are struggling because that's all they know. Well, if you could learn skill sets to get out of that in the right way, you can start to learn that, chaos can also lead to very poor decisions, which actually leads to more chaos. And that's why chaos keeps following us. If we can take a step back and follow a system, we're able to get out of that rut and actually make huge changes in our life and in our business world that are going to lead to the success and not failure each time.
I love the getting out of your comfort zone, being out there, and I'm obsessed with how do you make good decisions, which is
Mm-hmm.
something you just touched on. Because outside your, let's say, when you're in school, you get a test and they ask you what to solve this problem, and whether you get it right or wrong, that's up to you. But in life, there isn't even the problem. Like it's a situation outside of a controlled environment. It's uncontrolled. It's in the uncertainty. And in my world, it's uncertainty is seen as risk. Uncertainty is seen as potential outcomes. It's even called scenario analysis. It has many, many names, but this limits people to making decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm in the investment world and people want certainty, they want guarantees, they want things to
Yeah.
go out as they think they will. And they say, look, I need X amount of money because I need to pay this goal. Like it's very intertwined, and I find that it needs so much certainty.
Yes.
How would you look, or how can you advise to those people that are stuck in the analysis paralysis comfort zone of let's let's stay here, let's talk, let's analyze, let's learn, but never take that step into, okay, now in execution mode I'm going to discover it. In execution mode I'm going to make decisions.
So those people that you just described are typically reframers. So they're people that are excellent at being able to analyze data, reframe situations, look at things from different angles, but they have a fear of imperfection. So typically,
Mm.
if you are coming across people in your industry, or any industry for that matter, but in your particular industry, if you're coming across people that are like that, that just struggle to execute and take action, it's because they have this fear of imperfection. and they want to make sure everything is right, the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted before they actually take the action. Now, here's what I'm going to say to that is, it's like if you've ever read a really good book, right, really good business book, and you get some golden nuggets from it, right, or you pay to go to some seminar and you take some golden nuggets from that. What do you do with that information, right? Because everyone says knowledge is power. Knowledge is only power if you execute on it. Otherwise, it's just knowledge. And if you don't do anything with it, it's a complete waste. So it's like reading a really good book, having it sit on the shelf and it collects dust and it does nothing for you. Right? What is the point? What was the point in you spending your time learning that if you never actually go and take action? Nothing in life is perfect, right? We all are going to make mistakes. The sooner that we can accept the fact that we're not perfect, and no matter what you do, I actually see mistakes as a good thing because we learn from it, right? If we go out and we do something and we're not 100%, is this going to work? Is it not? You know what? The best way of moving forward in life is by making mistakes and learning from them, not from something you've just read and then you just store it. That, what use is that? In fact, it's your duty as that individual who has learned the information to go out there and prove to others that something can be done. It's your duty to share that information with others, right? That's how I look at it. I thought to myself, well, I created this grit system, to help me get through a really troubled time in my life. It would have been selfish of me if I had just kept it to myself. And I said, I actually have to teach this, to others. And so those types of people that you just described are absolutely notorious at wanting to create everything as perfection. But is the fear of imperfection greater than the fear of failure, right? So in other words, what I mean by that is, if you have this great fear of having imperfection, does the thought of you actually succeeding in that outweigh that fear, or is it vice versa? So in other words, picture yourself tomorrow or next week or next month. If you were taking action and you actually said to yourself, I'm going to do today something that I need to do to get me to where I need to be tomorrow, and you just took action regardless of whether it was perfect or not, right? And you just went out there and did it. What does that look like for you tomorrow? What does that look like for you next week? What does that look like for you next month? And vice versa. If you don't take that action and you continue to go back to the drawing board and keep trying to perfect, is that actually getting you to where you need to be tomorrow, next week, or next month? You have to picture that and visualize it and say, what is my life or my role in this job, whatever it is I'm doing, what does that look like tomorrow, next week, or in a month's time if I take action A, which would be to apply the G and actually go and execute, or if I stay in this comfort zone and I stay with this fear of imperfection, what does that look like? So you have to always say, it's kind of like you just got to throw everything up on a whiteboard and say, what are some of the options here? You might not like some of the options, but when you visualize it and you see it and it's clear, even as a reframer, and you say, okay, I can do option A, I can do option B, I can do option C, I can do option D, however many options there are. Like I said, you don't have to like what some of the options are, but the more you start to accept that actually, if I do option A, that's now going to lead to this scenario or this scenario. If I do option B, it's going to lead to this one, and which one is going to give me the better outcome and get me to where I actually need to be. So that's how I try to get people out of their fear of imperfection. And it's really, reframers are logical. So you have to really approach it from a logical perspective. It's very rare to have anybody that has a fear of imperfection to be someone that thinks from their gut, because they usually do take action and they just go with what that emotion is telling them in that moment. Whereas reframers are extremely logical. So you have to approach it from a logical perspective. If you try to approach it from an emotional one, they'll just shut down.
I love it. I agree with you. I think that and I appreciate that insight, because there is emotional people that need to be framed emotionally, and then more logical people. And you think that because it's investing or finance, hard numbers or projections, math, statistics, it should be logical. But if you present it that way, it kind of like shortcuts the circuit and says like, oh, so wait, I don't want to see it in that light. I think that's very insightful. Mm-hmm. Let's go into success, because you said two things that are resonating in my mind. The first one was you became complacent with success. You took your foot off the pedal, you deaccelerated, and you said that was a mistake. Mm-hmm. what's the key insight? Why did you do that? Why did you feel the complacency? And so I see it the other side more, honestly. As a critique to society, I see people that could achieve more, but they don't have their foot on the pedal at all. They're coasting. They're like, oh, right now I'm thinking about opening a business. I'm thinking of investing. I'm thinking of saving. I'm thinking, and I'm never do anything. Maybe my G is like yours. I'm a go-getter, and then I also take a lot of responsibility. The reframing was a little bit different for me because I don't reframe that much. I'm more of a let's go do it type of personality. But what lie about success bothers you the most?
So there's a very simple answer to this, right? I'll just give you, because you asked me about like why did I do that, even as a go-getter. Wise, well, I looked at grit in a very one-directional way, if you will, and I think I got tired. Just like a lot of people, they when they think of grit, they think of it as this, you've got to keep grinding and grinding. And I was, if I'm perfectly honest, I was tired, and I felt like I needed a little break. I needed a breather. And it's not uncommon, to find entrepreneurs kind of stuck in that, God, I'm tired, right? Now, that's when I realized I developed this. And actually, after the loss of my son, I turned to fitness in a massive way. I've always been a fitness enthusiast and always been great at it, but I actually took it seriously, and I became an athlete, and I became a competitive athlete, and I started training like stupid amount of hours a week on top of building the business. I would run 30, 40 miles a week on top of doing strength training, and I become what's called a high rocks athlete, right? Those of you that know high rocks, it's a global competition that you can enter, as a just as open or pro, and there's elites. I always raced in the pro category, and I will tell you something that what I realized, and why I'm telling you that story, is it's actually very simple. When you look at sports, right, what do you have to do to be able to recover? You have like a system and a process. You can't just train and warm up, right? You have post recovery, and there's a lot of things that you do to kind of recover your body from the stress that you've just put it through. But what we don't do in society is we don't put our minds through post recovery. In other words, we're not checking our grit, right? We're not actually making sure that our hardware is looked after in order for our software, which is our brain, because our brain's an organ, right? In order for our software to function at its optimum level. So I developed something called the 5 pillars that I follow absolutely to the T, like 100%. And the first one is I drink a gallon of water a day, because our bodies are mostly made up of water, right? So why, the people that don't drink enough water, I always say to themselves, why? And no, coffee doesn't count, and sodas don't really count. You've got to, like, I am big on water. And when I started changing that, and you realize that some of those days that you feel tired, it's actually because you're dehydrated, right? I have water on my desk all the time. Like, I have so many different bottles all the time, and I'm drinking literally like a fish. So water is a huge one. My second pillar is sleep. Now, I get asked all the time, because I coach, I'm an executive coach as well, and I coach a lot of C-suite individuals, and they often say to me, but Lara, I've got this project, and even entrepreneurs, they say, Lara, I've just got to keep grinding. I don't have time to sleep what my body actually needs. Now, the optimum levels, and of course there's going to be some exceptions, but the optimum levels typically are 7.5 to 9 hours. And actually, through my research, females actually do need more sleep than males. However, 7.5 to 9 hours is about, the average that a human being needs as an adult. And if you are not doing that, and you're sleeping, say, 5 hours a night, 6 hours a night, some people can get by on 6 hours a night. My husband now, like, he thrives on 6 hours. He's fine on that. But he's also military. So he's probably been trained that way for a very, very long time. He can actually survive on less than that. But for the average, human being that's not military or hasn't been trained in a specific way, then, you're not doing yourself any justice at all if you're just getting 5, 6 hours of sleep a night. Now, people say to me, these very busy individuals, they'll say, but Lara, I don't have time to sleep 7.5 to 9 hours because I've got all this work I have to get done. And I said, No, you're just prioritizing in the wrong areas. In other words, if you were to put it on your calendar, because everyone tends to live by their calendar, right? If you put your sleep and said, okay, this is the end of my day, this is my wind down for the night, and 45 minutes before you want to go to sleep, you start winding down. You don't look at your phone. You actually start to relax your brain. And then you put on your calendar, I'm going to sleep from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., just as an example, right? Obviously, you can do it however you want, but 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. And that's my sleep window, and nothing's going to disturb that. Now, if you put it on your calendar, you're much more likely to create that good habit because you start realizing now I've got to protect that time. So then you realize, okay, well, in order for me to get that amount of sleep, I have to shut down at least 45 minutes to an hour before, which means before that, I need to make sure, I've had dinner, I've cleared up, whatever. And before that, I have to make sure these projects and assignments are done, etc., etc. So you work backwards, right? And suddenly you realize, okay, so my work day is this amount of set hours, whether it's 4 hours, 6 hours, or 8 hours. You say to yourself, I've only got this amount of time in the day to get done what I need to get done. And trust me, you become much more efficient and much more quick at being able to carry out those tasks because you've only got a certain window. It's when we just let it drag on and we let our work blend into our home life, and we take work home with us. And or even if you work from home, once you leave the office in your home, that's it. You shut the door, you leave it. Right? Because you have to learn how to switch focus. It's not necessarily switching off. And I talk about that in my book because I have a tough time switching off from anything. I like to say I switch focus. So when I walk out of the office, I'm now focused on my family, and I do not give up that time for anybody. So it's all about learning priorities. So you're going to gallon of water a day is the first pillar. Getting the adequate sleep is the second. The third is nutrition, right? It's eating clean. And what I mean by that is like no processed foods. The amount of rubbish that is in foods these days is unbelievable. I'm big on whole foods and eating really clean. And when you do that and you try it out, you realize, wow, I'm able to think clearer. I can think smarter. I can think, much more quickly. And then fourth pillar is getting, about 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight a day. And you typically want to do that in the morning. It helps regulate your system, and it's really, good for sleep purposes as well. But sunlight is important. We do need that, on our skins. It activates something, helps our brains as well be able to think a lot sharper. And then the fifth one is exercise. And it's working out, say 5 days a week, at least 30 minutes, get that heart rate elevated. Doesn't have to be anything as crazy as, my types of workouts are. You can go for a fast-paced walk, right? Anything, just get your body moving. We have legs, they were built to move, right? I've got friends that unfortunately don't have legs because they were military and they don't have them. And so it's selfish if we don't utilize ours. Like, why are we, not moving our bodies the way that they're intended to? And in fact, I do have bonus pillars, and my bonus pillars are no alcohol and no caffeine. And people look at me as if I'm crazy, but to me, they're drugs for the body. I don't need them. I don't need to rely on caffeine. I definitely don't need alcohol. Alcohol just slows your thinking down. Caffeine, in my opinion, becomes something that you rely on. And I don't want to rely on anything, right? If I feel tired, guess what? I'm going to drink water. And that's actually the way that that's what really helps me. So by following those pillars, that's how you can go about making sure your grit is checked and it doesn't lead to burnout. And in that case, if you're following those pillars, you are far less likely to burn out from anybody else. And you're definitely less likely to take your foot off the gas, because it will actually give you more energy and it will empower you to keep doing more and more. And I just want to tell the listeners here that if nobody believes me, I just traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast. I took 8 flights in a week, right? And I've been giving keynotes and workshops with big sales teams, and some of them are smaller sales teams. I did do a lot of sales kickoffs, right? And I've just traveled from West Coast to East Coast. I was 8.5 months pregnant when I did that. I'm now 9 months pregnant. In fact, I'm due to give birth pretty much any week now. And I'm here sitting with you and I have all this energy. So if anyone says to me, Lara, I just get tired, and you know what? I'm 9 months pregnant doing this and I have so much energy. You know why? Because I follow my 5 pillars, and then my non-negotiables. They are just habits that I've created that just work very, very well for me. And they allow me to really think clearly, think sharply, and take action when I need to. So if I can do it, anybody can. That's what I like to say.
Oh, wow. So congratulations on being pregnant. Thank you for being here. You really are a force of nature, but I think that what you just mentioned and the analogy with a pro athlete is incredible, especially for those entrepreneurs, grinders, hard workers that, if you're always on, you cannot perform. Eventually you can't run every day all day. You have to have these pillars. And I liked your 5 and 6. I don't drink any alcohol either. I do drink coffee though, but more for pleasure than for the drug. I think it's just a moment of peace for me, and I like it because it's simple. It's not, you don't need to read a very complex book to drink water, to sleep well, to feed yourself, to exercise. Those are all very simple things that, like, everybody could do. Um, what's, if I may, the last question? If someone listening wants to become unstoppable in execution, what should they eliminate starting tomorrow?
Well, what should they eliminate? I will say this: instead of focusing on what they should eliminate, I'm going to focus on what they actually should be doing. And one of the biggest things is your environment. So you've got to look at yourself and say, who am I surrounded with? Because you do become, part of who you listen to and surround yourself with. I'm very big on that. So I cut any negativity out of my life. And also the one thing I really want people to hold on to is you've got to have belief in yourself. So that's where I say to people, what's your vision? What's your mission, right? What's your purpose? And I'm not saying that from a business perspective. I'm saying that from a personal perspective. For example, like when I was laying there dying in that hospital bed, I said to myself, and I started bargaining, for my life. I'm like, listen, if I get to live and I make it through this, I'm going to make it my mission. Then I'm going to impact at least one person for at least one day for every day I'm breathing. And that is what I fall back on the hard days. So on those where people have bad habits is, they might wake up and they feel tired, right? They might think, I don't feel like doing this today. And they kind of come up with these excuses of, well, I know I set myself this task, but I don't need to do it. It's okay. Like if I'll do it tomorrow instead. No, that's not okay, because you've just now broken your non-negotiable. You've just now broken a rule that you set for yourself. And now your brain starts to think that it's okay to keep breaking these habits. So you really have to eliminate bad habits and identify the good ones, right? But also identify, who do you surround yourself with? Because I'm a huge believer that we don't get anywhere in life by ourselves. We have to surround ourselves with people that know more, that have done more, that you can really learn from, whether that's mentors, coaches. You absolutely got to look around you and say, how do I get to where they're at and that type of success that I want? How did they do it? Because at the end of the day, they're human beings, right? If I look at pro athletes, or if I look at really successful people that have made millions doing what they do, take Tony Robbins, for example, right? He's just a human being, just like the rest of us. He doesn't have any specific secret to what he does. No, he follows good habits. And he never gave up. He always had belief. And that's how I look at myself, right? I always had belief, even when I came to this country with nothing. And I didn't even go into that. But when I did come to this country with nothing, and when I say nothing, I had a laptop and a brain. And there was a period of time that I didn't even have enough money to eat. I had to sacrifice eating for 3 days so I could pay my rent. And then there was another time, not shortly after that, that I became homeless because I couldn't pay my rent anymore. And I had to sleep on people's couches. And I came from a very successful background, and my family said to me, what are you doing? Just come back to England. You can walk into a 6-figure salary and all this goes away. Well, that was the easy button. That was the easy option. Why would I do that? Because all that's doing is teaching people that there's always an easy option. You can just run back down to comfort. That doesn't make you grow, right? Remember the comfort, the fear, the learning, the growth. If I just kept running straight back down to comfort, how am I ever going to get to growth? So we do have to face those fears, and we have to face those fears with grit, right? The G.R.I.T. Face it with grit. learn from people. If you're feeling like you're a failure, you're not a failure. You're only a failure if you give up and you never try again. But if you keep getting back up and you look at that and say, what did I learn from that? And you know what? It's just like a lion, right? They go out, they hunt. If they miss a kill, do you think they're going to run back to their cubs and with their tail between their legs and say, man, I suck? We're all going to die because I didn't make that kill? No. It just goes back out. It doesn't know any better, right? It just goes back out. It just tries and tries and tries and tries again. And that's the same with us, right? We actually are very resilient individuals. So every single person has this in us. Look at us when we were babies, right? We learn how to crawl, how to walk, how to talk. We get back up so many times after falling down, we don't even remember. The only difference between that of being a really gritty baby and child and who we are today is the environment that we're in. And people will say, well, I had a bad childhood. Well, you know what? I went through really bad trauma in my childhood leading up through my teenage years. Very bad. You can read about it in the book. I won't talk about it right now. But I will tell you that, have I let that define who I am? No, I've allowed it to shape who I am, because I've taken from that what I've learned to ensure that that doesn't ever happen again, right? And to learn that, okay, this was crap, this happened to me, I hate that it happened, but you know what, it did, and I can't change it. So what am I going to do differently to ensure that never happens again? And how can I better myself? How can I get out of this rut? So it doesn't matter what childhood you had, or what background you come from, whether you had no money or you came from money. I had nothing, right? And I built what I have today. I built a business from nothing to $1 million in 1 year. If I can do that, going through everything I went through, there is really no excuse. The only excuse that you give yourself is allowing that fear to take over and living and staying in that fear. That's not a life to me. That is just it's not actually doing yourself justice. It's not doing anybody else justice. You've got to learn to get out of that fear, and that's where the global grit system comes in to help teach that. And then on the flip side of it, because I'm so big on the behavior foundational stuff, right? Because we have to learn that. Then I was getting people that started to master it, but then still struggled with the skill set then, especially in sales, the skill set to be able to close certain situations, like close deals, close this, close that. And so that's how I came up with my book that's coming out called Close or Be Closed. And I created something called the Close System. But I feel like that's a completely different conversation for another day. But I do want people to understand that, listen, you have to navigate the behavior first. You have to understand who you are, how you navigate that behavior, how you communicate with people using the global grit system. And then you can be ready to learn the skill set on how to close deals if you're an entrepreneur, or if you're in any type of industry where sales is at the forefront. So long answer to what you just asked me, but I'm obviously very passionate about this, and I'm a huge believer that you've got to change your environment. You've got to create the belief always within you, no matter how many people think that you might fail or don't believe in you. I don't care. They're not you, right? They're not you. You are you. You know what you're capable of. If you keep allowing other people to influence you in a negative way, then that's on you. You have to cut that out. You have to focus yourself around people that can influence you in a positive way and actually do believe in you, and that obviously helps create the motivation to act if you carry that belief through in everything that you do. And ultimately, you never, ever give up, ever.
Laura, you definitely accomplished your vision of impacting one person a day. You impacted me tremendously today. So I want to thank you for that. And I think you're the reason why I started this podcast. It's called Return on Identity, because I wanted to know not the return on investment that you did. That to me is a little bit boring. It's more, how did you change yourself to be who you are today? And you certainly delivered on that. So I'm very, very grateful. And I want to invite you back, hopefully, if you're ever in Miami, it could be in the studio, or we can do another one, because my questions on sales now are all unanswered, and I think I would love to have you back on.
Absolutely. I would be honored to. And that is a huge passion of mine as well. Obviously, sales has been my career for many years. So yes, lots to talk about there. I'd be honored to come back on, whether it's in person or virtual. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.